Beautiful, isn't it? All right, everybody, welcome to class. Today's class, we are in Taiwan, in the city of Taipei. Has anyone ever been to Taiwan? What about Taipei? If you have, please mention that in this week's discussion board. But behind me is a very, very beautiful temple. This is a temple dedicated to an individual that becomes known as Confucius. Confucius, in one sense, is a very ancient individual, but a relatively new name to emerge in Chinese history. Okay, so that brings us to today's lecture. Today's lecture is just going to be a short introduction. This is a two-part series on Confucianism. All right, let's take a look. As you guys can recall, we have been talking about the religions of China, and over the next couple of weeks, we're going to learn the importance that these different ruling groups, now the particular style of government, this is when we have family, when power is kept in the family. You have a king, maybe an emperor, and the succession is kept within the bloodline. It could be the king's nephew, the king's brother, often the king's son. So the head of the government is based on family and blood descent. We call this a dynasty. In the dynastic history of China, we'll have many dynasties, and we can see some of the names here. In this history, three religions will catch the attention of the different dynasties and have varying degrees of influence in the different dynasties. And these three religions are Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. All right, and last week we started things off with the Shang dynasty. This is the first dynasty of which we have written records, and we can maybe definitively say that we have ample evidence of its existence. There is another dynasty, according to Chinese history sources, the Xia dynasty, but we don't have a lot of evidence for that dynasty. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's just we don't have any written materials of that period to really attest to that. And let's just review a little bit about what we learned when we visited Shang last week. Well, this is the concluding points of the last lecture. We learned that in Chinese history, it's divided. These are history writers in China. Divide the history of the peoples of China into different periods. The earliest period of history is referred to as the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, or the 5 emperors and 3 sovereigns. These were the moral stories and role models. And this is the first ancestor of all of the people, the different ethnic groups that make up China supposedly emerges in this period. Who is that common ancestor? That is our yellow emperor, Huangdi. Our first really dynastic ruler is associated with the Xia dynasty, and that's Yu the Great. And what made Yu so great was his ability to learn how to live in harmony with the rivers, to live in harmony with the water. And he does this not by fighting against the flood waters, but learning to irrigate, to make different engineering structures that allows water to naturally flow in a way that water harmonizes with the earth and society can flourish in relation to the water. The Shang, we saw our first dynasty of written records. And what were those written records? These were records often of divination and rituals written on oracle bones. The Shang king is a priest king. This means that the king often will try to divine the will of heaven and will attempt to use these different oracles to tell the future, whether it's going to be a good harvest, when to go to battle. The Shang people were part of a henotheistic society. Henotheism, again, is the term. It's polytheism with one high god, and the high god is Shangdi. Care for the dead and the ascent of the ancestors is very important. So these two themes of caring for ancestors and the rulers connected to heaven, this is going to follow all throughout the different dynasties, and all the three religions, major religions we're going to look at, will have to speak to how to care for the ancestors and how to have an ideal government that is modeled after heaven. Now we meet our new dynasty. This is the Zhou dynasty. And your textbook gives us the dates of circa 1122 to 256. And the Zhou breaks off into two different periods of time. We'll get into that next week. But it's a fairly long dynasty. And two important things that come out of it. Here we can see supposedly this, imagine this is a heavenly palace, because that's what it's supposed to be a picture of. And this heavenly palace where the Emperor of Heaven, Huangdi, resides, is shining light on the current ruler. Well, you want to be under the light if you're the ruler, because that means you have heaven's permission to rule the people. And heaven should assent to the ruler because heaven has given a mandate that this particular king rule. So we had the mandate of heaven, but then, societies, they have wars, they have battles, famines, bad rulers. In the era of the Zhou, we're going to get a new group called the Ru, the scholars, who are going to be very much interested in giving advice to the people, giving advice to the kings, giving the advice to those in governments. Among the most famous of members of the Ru that will arise in the Zhou dynasty is the individual that we now know as Confucius. Let's take a look. So first, the mandate of heaven. The Zhou builds on the Shang era idea that heaven and earth are connected via the king. So the government on earth needs to operate based on some higher divine principles. And that starts with the Shang, and the Zhou will evolve that into this idea of the mandate of heaven. The king and government, all the officials, must rule according to the principles of heaven. And a king is in power, not because the people elected the king, not because by happenstance, but for those who believe in this idea, the king is in heaven because the king knows how to rule according to the will of heaven, and heaven has declared, has given a mandate in order for that king to be in power. However, if the king rules badly, they lose the mandate of heaven. Heaven no longer shines light on the ruler, no longer gives the authority for the ruler. And with the loss of the mandate, the people have a right to revolt. The emperor is just not doing good for us anymore. Is treating us badly. Clearly, this is not the way that heaven would want a ruler to act. So we must overthrow this ruler so heaven can install a new one. So new rulers will claim the mandate of heaven, but can only keep that mandate so long as they rule justly, at least according to the principle. This is also part of how one regime justifies disposing of getting rid of another. So remember, we had before Zhou, we had the Shang dynasty. The historians of Zhou will categorize the last days of the Shang dynasty as just being very corrupt, as being full of favoritism, wastefulness, gluttony. Therefore, heaven took away the right of the Shang dynasty and passed the mandate to rule to Zhou. Subsequent empires will make the same claim when they get rid of the previous dynasty. Oh, our dynasty now has the mandate. That dynasty, they had the mandate. Now we have the mandate. So this is a key ideal for all of the dynastic histories of China, especially starting from the Zhou period onwards. We find roots of this with Shangdi and the priest king in the Shang era, but the Zhou really will develop this idea. All right, so we're at the Zhou dynasty, and now we start one of our first major religions, Confucianism. Why do I have these question marks? I'm confused. Why did I put question marks there? Does anybody know? No? Well, that's because we have some confusion about Confucianism that we need to clear up right now. Confucius and Confucianism are not terms out of a Chinese language. So these are not terms that are local or indigenous to the areas under the Chinese cultural sphere. They're not adopted as terms till much later. The term is used by Christian missionaries around the 16th century. These are Jesuit missionaries. Confucius, the individual identified as Confucius, was, and this is pronounced a little bit differently depending on the Chinese dialect, Kongchu. Kongchu is the name of Confucius. Sometimes Kung Fu Zu, I've seen that also, but Kongchu is a common term for referring to this individual. But for the missionaries, that was kind of like tough. So Kongchu becomes Confucius. And it actually takes a very Latin name. So they give a very Latin sounding name to this individual. Confucius was a scholar. The term there is Ru. Confucianism in the history of the Zhou dynasty and subsequent dynasties is often referred to as, and this is just one of many different traditions, the Ru Zhao, the tradition of the scholars. So Confucius is a Latinized form of Kongchu. Confucianism is also going to be a term that will be created by the Christian missions. But the terms that we want to know are the concept of the great scholar, the Ru, who can advise the people and the governments, and the traditions of these scholars, the writings of the scholars. This is what we call the Ru Zhao. And we're going to go with Confucius, just to be consistent. So Kongchu, or Confucius, came about during a time when things aren't going so well in the Zhou dynasty. We got war, chaos, war leading to death, to grief, to mourning, and Confucius does not like seeing this. And he decides to do what he believes all humans to do. He wants to, you might hear this term, you should become, you may have heard the phrase, and it doesn't originate here, you should become the change that you want to see. So Confucius wanted to know, how can we as humans develop ourselves, change ourselves, such that these horrible wars and conflicts don't happen anymore, that we have a harmonious society. So he designs an ethical system, a scholarly system, for three purposes. Heaven must be united with earth. So the way that things are in heaven, the peace of heaven, and we'll learn more about the concept, the Chinese concept of heaven in future lectures. So heaven, or Tian in Chinese, that becomes the role model for how we should operate on earth. Confucius wanted to have a just government, so we would not have war and chaos and violence. He wanted to have a moral society. This means that everyone's living in harmony with their friends, their neighbors, their family. And for him, the heart of this is that the individual must strive to become virtuous. Let's take a look at how to do that. All right, and we saw this earlier. This is kind of a paradigm of Chinese religions based on two principles. This is Tian, the symbol of heaven, where the heavenly ancestors reside and the heavenly emperor resides. Earth ought to operate in accordance with the principles of heaven. It is the emperor's duty to do so. Humans, this is Earth here, have to, part of how they cultivate themselves and live in harmony with heaven is to show alliance to the emperor who has the mandate of heaven, but also venerates the ancestors. According to Confucius, there's two cardinal virtues that we need to cultivate. Li. Li refers to etiquette, duties, ritual obligations. Things that we must do with our bodies, things that we must say, our behavior, in short, ethical behavior. This behavior becomes the basis of our second cardinal virtue, Ren. This is a genuine, heartfelt sense of compassion and benevolence. And these two work together. Li plus Ren. So think of Li as kind of the outer training, what we need, what we do. And the Ren is the transformation to becoming a more compassionate and benevolent individual. Li plus Ren is the foundations for these other virtues. These include righteousness, Yi, loyalty, Zong, and faithfulness, Sin. Moral, this is according to Confucius, moral training through study. So everybody study this weekend. We're all good students. We all study. Even I study. Through study, through proper actions, like maybe like wearing a mask during a pandemic. Well, I don't know. I'm sure he probably would agree with that. And then rituals, often geared towards the ancestors. All of these practices will help transform the self, who we are as individuals. This will allow virtuous government officials to run according to the mandate of heaven. And the ultimate ideal that everyone can strive to is this morally perfected being, this virtuous being, the sage, the Shenren. All right, so that was Confucius looking out at his time. He wanted to build good relationships. Yeah, look at these half people. Well, this is from an era that didn't require social distancing. But see, they're happy, they're at the beach, huddling together. Oh, look at this relationship. The puppy and the kitten, so harmonious. Not this, but this. Not this, but this. How do we get there? All right, so using these principles of Li and Ren, Confucius developed a model of society where father and son are in harmony, ruler and subject are in harmony, husband and wife are in harmony, elder and younger brother are in harmony, friend and friend are in harmony. So we have a whole society of healthy relations. That is something that is very much a concern of the scholars, the Ru of Confucius's time during the Zhou era. All right, now the lecture is about to conclude, but you need to get your books, and you're going to have to do the sign readings this week, because this week on the discussion board, we're going to ask this question: what would Confucius do? So January 6, 2021, we witnessed an attack on the US Capitol. This is unprecedented attack here in the United States. And Confucius didn't like seeing a society falling apart. He didn't like violence. So my question for you, and this will be in the discussion boards, and please keep an adult civil tone in our discussion boards. What might Confucius advise for the people and the government officials of the United States, given the turbulent political culture? You'll have two sources to look at. You'll have this book, which you have some readings out of. It's not showing up very well, but it's the Analects of Confucius. And it's not that much reading, but it's quite provocative. And then we have your main textbook. You're going to go through that and try to figure out if Confucius looked out and saw this, what advice might he give us? All right, well, this will conclude part 1 of our 2-part lecture on Confucianism. In the meantime, please stay safe, stay well, and stay tuned.